every age has art which defines it. During the Renaissance, when a revolution in perspective transformed Europe, artists discovered visual perspective. During the Enlightenment, novels explored the ideas of the time, like freedom and reason. And during the last century, the mass-produced art of cinema and popular music mirrored the industrialization of a capital-rich time. If, at the turn of the 21st century, one were to predict the art which would come to define it, a popular candidate might have been video games. But now, almost a quarter into the 21st century, it's not so clear. Sure, video games have become the most dominant form of entertainment, but will the medium make the jump to high art? Can Mario transition to Michelangelo? Today, video games dominate the culture. In 2019, the video game industry brought in $150 billion in revenue, almost 4 times the entire global box office in the same year. For perspective, in the opening weekend of the 2018 Western video game Red Dead Redemption 2, Rockstar earned over $725 million. That's more than the lifetime gross of Hateful Eight, True Grit, the 2010 True Grit, the Magnificent Seven, the 2016 Magnificent Seven, Unforgiven, 310 to Yuma, the 2007 310 to Yuma, the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, and The Wild Bunch, all combined in just 3 days. There's no doubt that video games are popular, but are they art? Traditionally, the artsy-fartsy scene shies away from popular media. High art tends to be an elitist concept, with critics preferring something niche and difficult over something accessible and popular, choosing Picasso over Pikachu. But the 20th century did pave the way for popular media to join the art scene, and not just in the pop artworks of artists like Roy Lichtenstein or Andy Warhol, but also in popular mediums like film and music. Even for the most pretentious, being entertaining isn't always a handicap. Even the most snobbish of critics have to accept the successful pictures like The Godfather or Singing in the Rain. It's not a leap to imagine video games carving out a similar art identity as film and television. Also, like Hollywood, the gaming industry has some of the world's most brilliant creatives at work. For instance, Hideo Kojima, the brain behind the Metal Gear series, clearly has artistic aspirations. And somehow it's humanly possible for a single human being to have the creative output which includes Donkey Kong, Super Mario, Zelda, Star Fox, and Pikmin. And it's not only the directors of video games. The bulk of the labor on these projects are artists in their own rights. Any major video game release is brought to life by hundreds and thousands of graphic designers, artists, and engineers. But this does not necessarily add up to their work being art. Most of the creative output in these productions are more craft than they are art. Just scroll through a terrible movie like Transformers: Dark of the Moon. It's no doubt populated by at least a dozen or so Mensa members. But is anyone arguing that this movie is art?
I'm gonna hit you. I'm gonna hit you right back, son.
Even when some of the greatest creative minds in the world collaborate on a project, the result is rarely a worthwhile piece of art. Just look at the 2013 film The Counselor. you've probably forgotten about it, which honestly is for the best, since it is really bad. I mean, really, really bad.
Then she leans down to see if I'm watching. Like, no, I'm sitting there reading my email.
But it's stacked with creative talent in the cast and crew, even with writing done by bona fide genius Cormac McCarthy. But more on him later. Clearly, popularity, entertainment value, financial success, or even the creative genius of the participants involved are not conclusive factors in what makes something art or not. But then what would video games have to do to become the dominant art form of the century?
We all expect to be judged. I think ultimately we are the only people who will judge us.
There's no doubt that Alan Moore is a genius. The man wrote the greatest comic ever, Watchmen, a piece of work so transcendent that Time magazine ranked it in the top 100 novels of the 20th century, right next to Hemingway and Faulkner. If that wasn't enough, the man also wrote Swamp Thing, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, From Hell, and V for Vendetta. He's also a little strange.
At the end of the evening, I suddenly announced that I was going to henceforth become a magician.
He literally believes in magic, like real magic. Sometimes Moore can come off as a bit of a grouch when he decries Hollywood's adaptations of his work.
Absolutely not. It's the thing that I'm dead set against is basically its adaptation.
But one glance at the adaptations, and it's not that hard to see why. The From Hell movie is a far cry from the comic. Batman the Killing Joke is worse than a bad joke. And The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was so bad it made Sean Connery retire from filmmaking. But even when the adaptations are done well, like in the 2020 TV series Watchmen, Moore disagrees with the approach. For him, it's a philosophical disagreement about storytelling under a certain medium. For Moore, the story should be told in a way that fits the medium. If the story is told appropriately, a change in the medium, like in the case of the change from a comic to a film, will deeply change the structure and themes within the story. Moore's comics are masterpieces, specifically because they master the medium of comic books. So, what makes the comic book medium unique? This is the central question to Scott McCloud's work, Understanding Comics, the Invisible Art. At first glance of the cover, you wouldn't recognize just how packed with insight this book is. For most people, comics are simply a series of pictures, nothing too complicated. But McCloud highlights exactly what makes them unique. You might just see comics as a series of sequential visual art, but very quickly you see how that definition falls short. Aren't animations simply a sequence of visual art? Even film is a sequential visual art. What makes comics different from animation and film? The major difference is that animation and film are sequential in time. For a movie, each frame is projected on exactly the same space, the screen. In comics, each frame has a different space, and those spaces are juxtaposed, or side by side. McCloud further refines this definition until he sees comics as juxtaposed, pictorial, and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. That definition is very not fun for such a fun book, but basically his point is that comics uniquely use images to illustrate ideas through space and time. Moore is a master of manipulating both space and time. In his work, the orders of the panel, when and where they are displayed, manipulate time and space in a way that no other medium would allow. Just read Watchmen and immediately you'll see what he means when he says he tries to make his work unadaptable. But what does any of this have to do with video games? In many ways, the medium of video games is yet to find its Alan Moore, the genius who captures specifically why video games are unique, and tells a story or conveys an aesthetic idea in a way that only a video game could. For many, the more movie-like a game is, the better. Often, a game will be praised for how cinematic it is. But the race toward a movie-like experience in games will rob video games of what is unique to that medium. For a video game to stand on its own, it needs to be something more than just a cinematic experience. The future of the industry depends on what exactly that something more entails. In many ways, most video games are taking the exact opposite approach of Alan Moore. Their goal is to be more cinematic. There's a technical arms race to achieve lifelike graphics and frame rates to produce a truly cinematic experience. But is this the correct approach? One of the previous decade's greatest games is 2013's The Last of Us. At first glance, The Last of Us seems like a generic post-apocalyptic story. The world is destroyed for some vague reason, and there's this hardened father-like figure guiding a hopeful younger character in a bleak world.
Oh, baby girl. It's okay.
Okay, The Last of Us is pretty generic, but it's an amazing work nonetheless. The narrative, the visuals, the sound design, the gameplay, everything works. It's one of the industry's crowning achievements, but at the same time, it, more than any other game, highlights the limits of the industry's current approach. What does The Last of Us do for the genre that hasn't been accomplished in other mediums? Most of what makes The Last of Us memorable are the characterizations and cutscenes, but are those unique to the medium? Could you not imagine a movie of The Last of Us which was just as powerful? Cormac McCarthy, the genius who wrote that not-so-good movie, wrote a very good book. Just read the apocalyptic novel The Road, then play The Last of Us. There's a distinct difference in how The Road perfectly uses the medium of the novel to convey its ideas. This is not to say The Last of Us does not have gameplay to help advance the story. Many times the stalking and looting and crouching of the game uniquely shows the horrors of that way of life in a way that perhaps a movie would fall short. But The Last of Us suffers from a convention common to most AAA games, where they juggle back and forth between game modes and cinematics. It creates a very pause and play, staccato-like feeling of play, watch, play, watch, play, watch, play, watch. Am I experiencing something or am I watching it? This is unique to video games. No other medium has this level of confusion. Comics, movies, television, and novels provide a consistent experience. They know what they are. What are video games?
Come check this out. St. Dismas. We meet again.
Uncharted is a game which gets a bit of shade from its mindless gameplay, but at least it knows what it is. Uncharted is like a roller coaster with buttons that are supposed to give you the illusion that your actions are doing something, even if everyone knows the entire time the experience is clearly on tracks. But in this way, ironically, Uncharted has a clearer vision of what it is than a much better game like The Last of Us does. The Witcher is one of the best looking games ever made. It also uses the video game medium to tell its story through questing and adventuring. It, perhaps more than any other game, gives the best experience of questing to date. But it also suffers greatly from the stop-start rhythm of juggling between quests and cinematics. The God of War remake hoped to avoid this trap by making the game appear like a single shot. The camera doesn't cut as if we're inside a edgy movie or an episode of Mr. Robot. But instead of providing an answer to the problem of pause play cinematic jumping, God of War simply blurs the lines. To date, no game has perfectly realized what the medium can uniquely do, but there are a few that have come pretty close. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild is one of those games. To see this, try to imagine a perfect version of the Breath of the Wild in another medium. If you were to read a comic or novel of Breath of the Wild, you would miss something. If you watched a movie or even a long television series on the game, you wouldn't capture the exploration, the themes, the feeling of being in that world. You can't watch or read the Breath of the Wild. You have to experience the Breath of the Wild. At its most basic, the game is about loss, about being lost. It's about exploring, being in nature, making friends, encountering foes. The story is paper thin, but if you're playing Breath of the Wild to advance the story, you're missing the point. If you want a good medium to see a story about a princess being saved, look to epic poetry. If you want to experience the feeling of being lost in a beautiful, strange, and dangerous world, play Breath of the Wild. In a genre and franchise known for its grand narratives and epic soundtrack, Breath of the Wild is the exact opposite. It's about the quiet. You can literally hear the Breath of the Wild throughout the game. This is also why so many of the game's story beats play so well. There's a moment in the Breath of the Wild where you can acquire the Master Sword if you've proven your worth. On the surface, it seems like a basic sword in the stone gimmick, but by the time you can finally pull the sword, you have experienced the growth of your character. You've spent countless hours in the quiet. This is the epic moment you've earned. On the surface, the moment is as cliche as any claiming the weapon moment of hero narratives. You've seen this a million times. But Breath of the Wild makes you feel it in a way unique to its medium. It's also interesting that in a medium so obsessed with realizing more lifelike graphics, Zelda does the exact opposite approach. Art long learned aesthetics and beauty don't rely on capturing the reality of the situation. Notice how artists spent thousands of years trying to realize a technology which could capture reality closely. And then the moment they finally had the inks and paints and brushes and films and techniques to pull it off, they went in a completely different direction. The goal of realistic rendition was always an empty one. But Breath of the Wild is still limited. Its scope is still confined. Like the great animation films in cinematic history, there is a ceiling to what they can artistically accomplish. Walt Disney, at his best, falls short of Stanley Kubrick every time. Pixar can't catch up with Psycho. Spirited Away will always play second fiddle to Seven Samurai. But whether or not it's Toy Story or Tokyo Story, the art community has a hard time ignoring the cinema of the 20th century. If the gaming industry continues in the way of the Breath of the Wild, the same might be said for video games in the 21st century.